how do you go about writing a news story? How do you organise the information into a news story?
The best thing that you can do is, the thing that I look for most is what we call a news line on a news story. So what I'm looking for when I'm reading a news story is a standout line, is something that kind of makes me initially very interested in it and makes me want to read more. So that's the very first thing that I would look for in a news story. Once I've found that line, I would then look for maybe 2 or 3 similar kind of strength lines where once again it's going to make the reader very interested, it's going to make them want to read on. So certainly for the first 3 lines of a story, I'm looking for something which not only sums up the story but sums it up in the way that's going to have the most impact. Once I've got those 3 lines, it's then often a case of, particularly if it's a human interest story, it's then a case of getting in quotes from the relevant people, quotes from the most important people in the story, quotes that have the most impact, and which again are going to kind of reel the reader in a little bit more. It's always good, particularly in regional journalism, to get that kind of local interest, to get that human touch, which, you know, generally your readers are most interested in.
So when you talk about the line of the story, you're talking there about the kind of aspect of the information that is going to appeal most to people. Is that what you mean? The thing that's most interesting? And how do you judge that? Is it always the same thing, or can it be a variety of different lines that jump out to you?
It can be many different things. Personally, it tends to be what's most instinctual to me. So whichever line I'll look at and I find the most interesting, the most important, then that's the one that I will pick out. Generally you'll find that your reporters are on the whole quite good at spotting the news line in a story, and therefore will go in on that with their introduction rather than you having to find it yourself. But there are times when, you know, there's a particularly good line which can be buried somewhere deep within the story, and you've got to kind of dig it out and maybe redo the story to have the most impact on that.
And if you're looking at various, obviously for example in a news conference in the morning, where you as the news editor would come in and tell the editor what stories are available and which ones you find interesting, which ones you think should be important, how do you decide between different types of story? I mean, if there is, say for example, a story about lots of people losing their jobs versus a story about one person who's involved in a personal tragedy, what kind of things do you think about when you decide on which of those is the most important for the newspaper?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, you've picked 2 subjects there which, you know, tend to divide conferences in every newspaper across the land in the morning. I mean, if you've got a story in which a lot of people are losing their jobs, and it's obviously going to have a high impact on your readership, it's going to have a high impact on the families of your readership. So you certainly want to, you know, consider that to be very, very high on your news list. But likewise, if you know someone has suffered a personal tragedy, then, you know, those stories personally are stories that I look for because they've got a real human element to them. And I'm a big believer that in regional journalism, people want to read about other people. People want to read about people like them. People want to know more about their neighbours. They want to know more about people who are living in their community. So, I mean, often it's very difficult to decide if you're placed in a situation where you've got 2 stories such as the ones you've mentioned. You know, it's often very difficult to decide which one you're going to use on the front page and which one we'll maybe do on, you know, as your second lead or as a page 3, 5.
And I imagine there's practical considerations that come into play as well. For example, if one of the stories has a really strong photograph or something like that, does that ever sway how you decide to present the stories?
Yeah, undoubtedly. I mean, I can't emphasise enough how important it is to have a good, you know, visual element to your story, and that's something I would encourage all reporters to look for, is that, you know, how can they support their story with a strong visual element. A photograph can often make a story. In fact, sometimes you need very little of the story if your photograph tells a story within itself. So, I mean, that's a huge thing, and it's something that, you know, I would encourage any young reporters to consider when they're putting together a story.